Test 1, 2. Good evening, everyone. It's great to see everybody here. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Bobby Endyke, and I am one of the elders at Sola Church. And we want to welcome you tonight to a Kingdom Worldview with Michael Ware. Just have a couple quick announcements as we get started. First, I want to say a big thank you to Denver Seminary for your sponsorship for this event and your partnership here. We're very thankful for that and for your attendance. One of the most important announcements is coffee is coming. The Keurig is broken, so we have requested assistance from the cafe, and they'll be giving us coffee here in just a few minutes. We, as you can see from the agenda, we have just a quick welcome. Then we'll have a keynote address from Michael, breakout discussion, some Q&A, and closing remarks at the end. So we look forward to this night and continuing this conversation around a kingdom worldview. It is my pleasure to introduce Michael Ware. Michael Ware serves as a chief strategist and a member of the executive team for the AND campaign. He is a leading expert, speaker, and strategist at the intersection of faith, politics, and American public life. As one of President Obama's ambassadors to America's believers, Michael directed faith outreach for President Obama's historic 2012 re-election campaign. He was also one of the youngest White House staffers in modern American history. He served in the White House Faith-Based Initiative during President Obama's first term, where he led evangelical outreach and helped manage the White House's engagement on religious values, including adoption and anti-human tracking efforts. Michael is also the founder of Public Square Strategies, LLC, a sought-after firm that helps religious organizations, political organizations, businesses, and others effectively navigate the rapidly changing American religious and political landscape. He is also the author of Reclaiming Hope, Lessons Learned in the Obama White House about the Future of Faith in America. He also writes for The Atlantic, Christianity Today, USA Today, Relevant Magazine, and other publications on faith, politics, and culture. Michael is a senior fellow at the Trinity Forum, and he holds an honorary position at the University of Birmingham's Cadbury Center for the Public Understanding of Religion. Michael and his wife, Melissa, are both proud natives of Buffalo, New York. They now reside in Northern Virginia, where they are raising their beloved daughter, Saoirse. So I would like to welcome Michael. So if you would, please give it up for Michael Ware.
Great. Can you hear me? It's so great to be with you all. Thank you so much for making it out. Good to see some familiar faces in the room. Love making it out to Denver. This one's a quick trip, but I still love being able to see the sunset. And it's just beautiful out here. I always go back to the East Coast and deal with claustrophobia for a while. I have to reacclimate to not being able to see the sky. But it's an honor and joy to be here with you this afternoon. I'm here this evening to share with you a bit of my story, some thoughts on how we as Christians ought to think about politics and the role of faith in public life. As was mentioned, we're going to make sure to reserve a significant amount of time for conversation and Q&A, and I'm really looking forward to that. I want you to know that I take the responsibility of speaking seriously generally, but especially when a church invites me. I kind of recognize that I'm entering into a community, and I will leave, and you all will still be here. And so that's important to me. There's nothing more important than the life of God's people together. It's what we believe eternity is made of. And so, I always hope that perhaps what I've offered will help you on your way. I think often of the Apostle Paul's travels and how he would visit local Christian communities or write to them, and the responsibility he felt, which comes through clearly in the New Testament. If there are non-Christians who are attending, I want to let you know that I'm so happy you're here. I'm going to speak tonight about the nature of our politics and how it affects us all. And this is a civic conversation. You're welcome to it. You might notice that we think and speak about politics tonight differently than you might hear on cable news or talk radio. For Christians, politics is important like so many things, but it gets its importance through its relationship to God and what God asks of them. And so I come here like everyone else with a political point of view and history, but that's not the most important thing about me or what I hope you will walk away with tonight. I want to talk tonight about how we steward our citizenship in light of the kingdom and glory of God, and how we might be faithful in these next 9 months, especially in what is going to be an intense season in the life of our country and the life of the American church. It might be helpful to provide you a bit of context on my background and how I ended up working in politics and Christian leadership. I grew up in Buffalo, New York, the son of a single mother who worked multiple jobs to keep our family afloat. I was close to my grandfather, who was kind of greatest generation, World War II, came back, was civically involved, worked 3 jobs, blue-collar guy. Wasn't very political, but he was the kind of guy that people came to for their problems, and that just felt like he'd be there to help them out. And that really struck me. Growing up, my family was not particularly religious. In Buffalo, it seemed as if everyone was born Catholic. It was a faith of rituals and rhythms that gave structure to the weeks and years. Religion was, quote, like brushing your teeth in the morning, my mother said. You just did it, which is not the most rousing theological call to faith, but it's what she mustered. So like brushing your teeth in the morning, you just did it. The millennial generation is the first to grow up in a time when religious skepticism is pervasive and accepted in mainstream American culture. Like many of my peers, I internalized messages about religion that I did not really understand myself. I was convinced the Bible was self-contradictory, though I had never read it. I viewed religion as a crutch without interrogating the actual experiences of religious people. I believed religion was anti-intellectual without considering the brilliance of the religious people I knew, or the fact that many of the great intellectuals of human history were themselves religious. In the same way, many in previous generations considered themselves to be Christian because it was reinforced by their peers and culture. I assumed God was unknowable and irrelevant if he existed at all. And yet I could not escape God. This God who did not exist was everywhere. My sister became a Christian a few years before I did, so spoiler alert, I'm a Christian. She worked at the best supermarket in the country, Wegmans. That's the one thing we have over the mountain. You guys have like mountains and like God created majesty. We have Wegmans. She was working at Wegmans as I would later on, and she was attracted to this young married couple that worked there. And she kind of felt drawn to them, and she found out that they were Christian. So she just kind of wanted to be around this couple. Started inviting her to church. They would hang out at night and sort of talk about things. And to make a long story short, soon enough, I had an evangelist in the room next door. She gave her life to Christ and was immediately working on me. I, in a very younger brother kind of way, was not just sort of indifferent but antagonistic. I would make fun of her. I would make fun of religion. I was not necessarily indifferent. I remember one time she tried to sit me down and walk me down Romans Road, and she had one of those big, like leather-bound Bibles that you have when you first become a Christian that you think is like a really great idea, and then you realize this like 20-pound thing, you can't take it anywhere, it doesn't fit in anything, so you need to buy like a smaller one that you could actually read. But she had the big leather-bound one, and I remember standing up at one point of the discourse, and I literally just chucked the Bible at her head. So that'll give you a good sense of where I was at the time. She, a little later on, she invited me to go to her youth group. And I thought at this time, I'll just get some more ammunition here to show her how stupid all of this is. And I went to the youth group, didn't like it. It was cliquey. I didn't get the language. I couldn't really fit in. She had a friend who knew that I wasn't a Christian at the time, came up to me and asked me, what's your favorite book of the Bible? Which I thought was a weird way to start a conversation, but I thought, I'll roll with it. These people are kind of weird. And before I could answer, she goes, well, mine is Hezekiah. And I said, well, what a coincidence. That's mine too. We're really connecting here. We have something going on. Of course, it wasn't until years later that I realized there is no book of Hezekiah. It was all made up. I should be over it by now, but I say it at events like this, and clearly it's a deep wound still. But on my way out of this youth group, there was a volunteer, Italian guy named Joe Vaccani, who, like I needed to say he was Italian after that name, who was handing out tracts of Romans. No commentary, no nothing, just Paul's letter. And he was standing next to the garbage can. I had sense enough not to throw it out right in front of him. So I took it home, read it over again. It changed my life. 3 days later, as my sister was driving me home from school, I told her I'd given my life to Christ. At that point, I thought, well, now I need to go to a good seminary like Denver Seminary, become a pastor, because like what else would a Christian do? I wanted to do like the most Christian thing possible. Thankfully, I had a pastor who was a minor in political science in undergrad, and he was like, Michael, look around. There are Christians who aren't pastors, which is, good. And so I decided I wanted to figure out what it meant to be faithful in public things. That's been the central vocational question of my life since I was 15, 16 years old. It's what brought me to Washington, D.C. It's what guides me now. I did know when I became a Christian 2 things about faith and politics. The first was I came to faith at sort of the height of like the first round of reckoning about what faith was doing in this country. It was sort of right in the time around President Bush's re-election. There was a lot of conversation about especially evangelicalism and American culture, American life. So I knew politics was affecting faith, not just the other way around. It's really important. I knew that politics was affecting the way the church was operating, not just the church operating the way, affecting the way politics was operating. Second thing I knew was I was never going to feel comfortable in politics again. Because I'd been interested in politics before I was a Christian, and that was like a pretty straightforward endeavor. The party puts out the platform, you pick your party puts out the platform, and you can basically just follow that. Like there's no higher authority you need to answer to. Maybe you, especially when you're 15, I wasn't really, didn't have the skill set to do too much deep inquiry, and so it was a pretty straightforward endeavor. When I became a Christian, all of a sudden I had this other bigger thing. I knew I couldn't be taking marching orders from any political party, from any ideology anymore. And so I came to DC with this knowledge. I was a sophomore at the George Washington University and was supposed to be leading a group of students to a political convention at the Washington Hilton Hotel. I'd never been to the hotel before. I'd never been to a political convention before. And I thought, this is going to be great. This is going to be awesome. I'll just go there, figure it out. Show up at the hotel. It's kind of sparse and kind of empty, but I figure I'll just like find the right ballroom and find the political convention. 10 minutes, 15 minutes later, I finally asked the receptionist, like, where is this thing? She goes, oh, honey, that's not for another couple days. Like, I just had the complete wrong date for this political convention. And so I'm embarrassed and dejected, walking through the hotel lobby. And as I'm walking out of the hotel lobby, walking into the hotel for meetings the day or two before the political convention was a young senator by the name of Barack Obama, who in just a few days would announce he was running for president. I had followed his career up to that point. He gave a speech in 2006 where he said that secularists were wrong to ask people of faith to leave their faith at the door when they entered political life. He called it a practical absurdity. And that was very moving to me. I'd only been a Christian for 2 or 3 years, was still trying to figure out what it meant to be a Christian in public life. And at an interesting time in our history when the incentives weren't exactly lining up for that kind of conversation in the Democratic Party, I saw this young guy, this former Harvard Law Review president, or editor of the Harvard Law Review, say some pretty interesting things. And so told him I wanted to work for him, and he connected me with some staff, and 9 months later I was in Iowa. So 12 years ago, almost to this week, I was in Iowa for the caucus. I won't happy to answer any questions about, I'm not really here to talk about my sort of political trajectory, but suffice to say, I served in the White House for the first 3.5 years of the Obama administration, and previous to that, I was part of the faith outreach team for the 2008 election, and then I had the honor of leading religious outreach for the president's re-election campaign. And from those 5 years at the center of power in our nation's politics, I was able to see up close some of our nation's finest minds try to tackle some of our most pressing policy challenges. I was inspired by what we were able to achieve, humbled by moments, opportunities, and accomplishments that I was able to be a part of bringing to fruition, like getting the adoption tax credit finalized and helping the administration bolster the fight to end modern slavery. I learned many lessons about our country, our politics, and the way faith intersects with it all during my time working for the president. Some of them were uplifting and hopeful, and some of them were quite difficult. And since I left formally working for the president, as I've traveled around the country over the last few years, I've become increasingly concerned about what politics is doing to our communities, our relationships, and our souls. Religion and politics are the two topics you're not supposed to discuss at the dinner table, so the saying goes. Have any of you heard this saying? Have you ever stopped to ask yourself why? It wasn't until recently that I came to think that the saying is generally true, but for opposing reasons. People don't want to talk about politics because they hold their views too tightly. Too much of their identity is staked in politics. People don't want to talk about religion because they are haunted by the idea that they do not stake their lives in the spiritual things in life, that God takes up too little space in their life. In his essay, Membership, C.S. Lewis writes, "A sick society must think much about politics as a sick man must think much about his digestion. However, if either comes to regard it as the natural food of the mind, if either forgets that we think of such things only in order to be able to think of something else, then what was undertaken for the sake of health has become itself a new and deadly disease." I've come to the conclusion that our culture, those in our churches, and many of our fellow citizens are sick with that new and deadly disease. The American Psychological Association found that 52% of Americans felt additional stress due to the 2016 election. The APA called it election stress disorder, and they recommended steps that people could take for relief. Teachers reported that students were fearful about the election outcome, even to the extent that they were having nightmares about it. In a follow-up study from the APA, the numbers jumped, showing that the number of Americans who view the future of the country as a significant stressor had jumped to 69%. 69% view the future of the country as a significant stressor, and those who saw the political climate as a source of stress had jumped to 62%. One 2010 study found that, quote, "societal shifts in political dominance can impact biological stress responses in voters whose political party becomes socio-politically subordinate." That's an academic, sort of complicated way of saying that when your party loses, your stress goes up. Just last month, a new study was released which showed that nearly 2 out of every 5 Americans say politics is stressing them out, and 1 in 5 are sleepless or have had friendships damaged over politics. Political campaigns understand and feed into this emotional pull of politics. Increasingly, political messages are not about policies. Instead, the policies proposed on the campaign trail are about sending a message and propping up a desired narrative. Our politics, and this is important, our politics is both driven by and guiding our emotions. Patrick Miller at Duke offered an important corrective to conventional wisdom on emotion and politics in his 2011 paper, where he showed that it is not just or even primarily low information, disengaged voters who allow emotion to guide their politics, but principally citizens with high political sophistication. In other words, there's sort of a stereotype, something that those who are politically educated tell themselves, oh, it's the people out there who are driven by emotion and don't take this as seriously as we do. No, actually, it's those who are reading the news every day, who are reading the blogs, who are following the horse race, who are not necessarily looking at it analytically so much as emotionally. It was interesting. Van Jones was saying a very similar thing on CNN last night in reaction to some recent events. The influence of political tactics is not confined to campaign dynamics. It affects how we are formed as people. Political polarization is at an all-time high. Instead of our values influencing our politics, our political circumstances are shaping our values. As partisans, we explain away the flaws of the candidate we support, and we buy nearly any outlandish theory about the candidate we oppose. We even change what we believe to fit the moment. There was another survey after Inauguration Day. Democrats' belief in conspiracy theories skyrocketed, and Republicans plummeted. And when President Obama was in office, it was the exact opposite. We're all now aware of the research that shows how political polarization is no longer a province of the Beltway, but is seeped out into the broader public. So you can no longer look at state capitals or Washington, D.C. and say, man, they're crazy over there, but thank goodness we have our stuff together. No, we don't. One 2014 study, get this, in the 1960s, when parents were asked, who would you not want your child to marry? They said, I would not want my child to marry someone of a different religion, and I would not want my child to marry someone of a different race. In 2014, they were asked the same question, not the same parents. Hopefully their kids are married at that point. In 2014, parents were asked the same question. If the parent was a Democrat, they said, I would not want my child to marry a Republican. If the parent was a Republican, they said, I would not want my child to marry a Democrat. Like, the political implications of that are clear. We see it all the time. We see it on the news every night. But just think about what it means for basic social cohesion, for how we live together. And of course, other research, Bill Bishop's research in The Big Short, shows that we no longer live together. We're actually ideologically segregated. We live near and around people who think the same way that we do. We consume media in ways that affirm our biases rather than challenging them. Politics is causing great emotional and spiritual harm in Americans' lives. And a big reason for that is Americans are going to politics to have their emotional and spiritual needs met. This is the meaning of rising polarization. It's the cause of our zero-sum mentality. Politics does a poor job of meeting spiritual needs, but if it will get your vote, politicians will attempt to fill the spiritual void nonetheless. Our politics can only cause such spiritual harm because our national life has become so spiritually vacuous. What we must recognize if we are to properly diagnose and treat that which ails our politics is that the state of our politics is a reflection of the state of our soul. Politicians can only manipulate those most personal parts of ourselves, our longings, our loves, our hurts, our passions, and our hatreds for their purposes because we make those things available for their use. The problem is not that we take politics too seriously. That's a mistake. The problem is not that we take politics too seriously, but that we take politics seriously in all of the wrong ways. Of course, Christians have been as complicit as anyone else in the state of our politics. And we need to come to grips with the fact that the state of our politics is, again, in the end, a reflection of the state of our souls, a reflection of who we are and the kind of people we are. And for Christians, the problem is not so much that there are broad swaths of Christians who make exceptionally bad contributions to our politics, but rather that for many, there is nothing exceptional about their politics at all. We are so often driven by the same self-interested, self-protecting motives as other voters. We are so often prone to the same partisan rationalizations, same politics of contempt as our political opponents, whoever they are. So a reasonable question to ask then, a question many Christians are asking, is why should we even care about politics? Knowing that politics has the risk of exposing such weaknesses in us, knowing that politics has the capacity for causing such harm, isn't withdrawal the best option? We can draw on many places in Scripture and in the Christian tradition that would help us understand how our faith pushes us toward the public. But let's talk about Jeremiah's message to the exile. Jeremiah 29, these people, God's people, find themselves in a land that was not their own, among a people who despised them. And yet Jeremiah's prophecy to them did not suggest that they lie low or that they take a posture of opposition toward the Babylonians. Instead, they are instructed to, quote, seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. For Christians, one inescapable conclusion of this extraordinary command is that we are obligated to work for the benefit and the flourishing of all people, whether or not they see the world as we do or agree with us in any way. Christians' obligation is not to their tribe, but to their God, a God who cares deeply for all people. And if a Christian's political ideas and actions are not intended toward the good of their enemies, their political witness is not Christian in its character. When it is, everybody benefits. Christians care about politics because we care about our neighbors and our community. And political decisions impact our neighbors' well-being. As a citizen, you do not choose to have political influence. You already have it. Therefore, sitting out of politics does not absolve you of blame for the state of our politics. Your sitting out is your choice about how to steward the responsibility you have been given. Faithfulness is not confined to any one sphere of life. It may look different in different arenas, but faithfulness is for all of life, including the political. A holistic pursuit of justice and the well-being of our neighbors is inconceivable without political involvement in this time, in this place, in this country. Politics is one of the essential forms in which we can love our neighbor. And so what I want to do is begin to stoke in us an imagination for what our politics would look like if Christians were more Christian. How might we think about politics differently if we participate in politics grounded in a confidence that Jesus actually has something worthwhile to offer us in that endeavor? I've spoken about polarization already, but just before I sort of jump into a couple examples, I want to add a few thoughts about party identity and how it feeds polarization. Because our parties are so polarized and party identity is so profound, we find that politicians and political parties have inordinate influence over the views of the citizenry. We have not invested such meaning into what a political party is and what it means to affiliate with one because of the nature of a political party, but because of what is in the interest of political parties and other political actors who benefit from them. That is to say, political parties demand our allegiance not because it is their right, but because it is in their interest. I want to make sure this is really, when you go to the DMV to register for a political party, there is no fine print at the bottom of that document that says, I hereby sign over my conscience to every jot and tittle of the party platform. But parties have really no coercive levers available to directly coercive levers available to like sort of make you fall in line. Political parties are vehicles through which we're able to sort of mediatory vehicles through which we're able to sort out the messy stuff of civic life. We don't join a political party for them to influence us. We join a political party to influence them. And yet we so often mix this up. Well, my conscience would not allow me to join. Well, if your conscience says there's something wrong with that political party, maybe your conscience is calling you to change that political party. My book came out in 2017, 3 days after the inauguration. So there was some other stuff going on in the news at the time. It has chapters on all kinds of like controversial issues And I was sure one of those was going to like get the most attention or cause me the most trouble. The thing that has been the most sort of upsetting for folks, especially when I go to college campuses, is I have like 2 paragraphs on political independence. And it's a pretty straightforward argument. I'm sure someone else has made it, but I wasn't familiar with the argument, but just my experience in politics suggested to me, I think people would be surprised to learn, some of you might be surprised to learn, at this point in our history, we have the largest number as a percentage of the population of political independence that we've ever had. So you hear the rhetoric often about sort of withdrawing from the political parties. Oh, I'm sending them a message. They're like this sort of idea, and I don't mean this, I do kind of mean to mock it. This idea that if you're a political and independent, like the parties are going to just miss you so much that they're going to change. And I just want to tell you, it's just not. It's not how it's working now, and it's not how it works. If you're not in the party, I mean, think about like life. Like if you're not at a party, like you're not there. You're not selecting the music. You're not bringing dishes for the potluck. You're just not participating. And if you're not there long enough, people don't really miss you. And so we end up in this situation where it's a kind of a vicious cycle where we have people leaving the political parties because they feel attention. They feel like there's no political home for them, which I certainly feel politically homeless. But what happens when people who feel that way take themselves out of the party process? What it means is that our political parties are left now basically only of people who completely agree with the party. Well, how is the party supposed to find any sort of justification for moderation or for changing their views on a subject if there isn't anyone left in the party speaking in the party process that is challenging them on those things? Now, there are some like instances where that has happened. So trade is a great example. 2016, the sitting president of the head of the Democratic Party said his #1 foreign policy goal was something called the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade deal. And yet we had a Democratic primary in which someone who almost won, Bernie Sanders, targeted that deal. And so if you look at the 2016 Democratic Party platform, when it comes to the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade deal, which again, the head of the party, the sitting president of the United States said, this is my #1 foreign policy priority. The platform basically says, look, we can agree to disagree. The party platform says, you know, you could be a good Democrat and support the TPP, you could be a good Democrat and oppose it. And that's a party platform. Very similar, by the way, to the language that the 2000 Democratic Party platform had around abortion, which is very different from the language it has now. In 2000, the Democratic Party platform welcomed pro-life Democrats into all leaders of party leadership, or all levels of party leadership. The party platform does not express openness on the issue today. And again, a big reason for that is there's no internal institutional effort to pressure the party on that issue. All right. The question is, how do we break this circuit? And are there viable examples of civic activity that can expand our political and moral imaginations and influence what citizens expect of their politics? I think of one moment in the 2012 campaign that remains a high point for me, and a reminder that our politics can create good culture, not just division and insecurity. Jenna Lee Nardella, some of you may know her, she's something of a wonderkind. At age 22, she co-founded and served as the executive director of Bloodwater Mission, a nonprofit that has raised more than $25 million. Bloodwater has brought water to more than 1 million people in Africa and provided health care for more than 62,000 people in HIV-affected areas. Jenna's influence and example have also had an outsized impact on the justice conversation in the American church. Along with Gary Haugen, I think of Jenna Lee Nardella as one of the leading voices that brought conversations about justice into conversation with evangelical theology and practice in the modern era. So the Democratic Convention which you guys hosted in 2008, was my first time in Denver, first time seeing the big bear, which was awesome. The Democratic Convention lasts 3 days, and so in 2012, as Faith Outreach Director, I had 6 slots to fill for the invocation and benediction each night, and I asked Jenna Lee to serve in one of them. For an evangelical Christian, the decision to speak at an event like Democratic Convention can't be taken lightly. The last thing you want to do is get involved in a controversy that could harm your ministry, either from anti-religious inquiry or from a donor base upset that you would dare pray with Democrats. Jenna asked for a bit of time to consider the invitation, during which she prayed, consulted with her husband, board of her organization. They encouraged her to take the opportunity, and so Jenna accepted. I smiled when I received an email from a campaign staffer flagging something in Jenna's prepared benediction. She had included a prayer for Mitt Romney, too. By the way, quick aside, would urge people praying for Mitt Romney today, but let's get back. I assured the staffer that this would be okay and that, well, it was too late to negotiate an alternative, so we were going to have to run with it. And so on the night of the convention, directly following First Lady Michelle Obama, Jenna Lee Nardella walks out, and with heads bowed and eyes closed, she led a stadium full of Democrats in praying for Barack Obama and Mitt Romney and for our nation. She did something fascinating, and another leader did a similar thing. Rich Nathan, who was head of, I believe he's still head of Vineyard USA, which is their prayers were basically 2 identical paragraphs. And the second paragraph just replaced Barack Obama's name from Mitt Romney's name. The prayer was a ray of light in a pretty depressing campaign season. And conventions are pretty depressing events. And you think about this prayer coming after, I mean, the whole point of conventions is to talk about how great your party is, how awful the other party is, how awful the other party's nominee is. And it was just jarring to then see on C-SPAN, sent around social media, videos of these Democrats bowing their head, praying that Mitt Romney is successful, that God would bless him and equip him with what he needs to serve the country. Christians and others shared the video of Jenna's prayer online as an example of what can happen when we hold our faith and each other's dignity as more sacred than partisan politics. In an increasingly polarized politics and culture, this is a powerful posture that we can take. We can take risks in the political arena to affirm that some things are more foundational than partisan politics. And when we see others do so, we can support them as they face people who do not understand. What Jenna taught us that evening was that politics can be about more than women. Here's another example of how a biblical imagination might motivate real change from the grassroots up. When the Apostle Paul was writing to the Galatians, he was addressing a community that was in deep disunity. Paul had helped form the Galatians through his teachings, but they were straying from their foundational commitments. Sin, false teachers, and parochial motives and interests were creating, well, polarization. Paul's letter to Galatians is to a polarized community. And so Paul's letter represents an attempt to speak clarity into the conflict and help the community reform around its foundation. And it is into this polarized environment that Paul instructs them to do something radical, something completely contrary to everything polarization promotes. I mean, I think today you would think, well, how would you speak to a polarized community? Maybe you encourage some kind of power sharing arrangement where maybe one of them gets to, run services, run the liturgy every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, and like they could trade off, and maybe a line could be drawn in the middle of the community, and one camp could stay on one side. Like how you do if you're a sibling and you share a bedroom. And these are the kinds of arrangements we go to. Like how do we just make sure that these polarized people don't kill each other? Paul advises Galatians 6:2. He says that they ought to. He says that they ought to carry one another's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the love of Christ. Paul's command shows no favoritism, This call is not to one group only, to those with power or without it, or even solely to the strong or the weak. Everyone together is a part of a community as children of the same God, and therefore they ought to carry one another's burden. A nation is a different sort of community, but it is a community. And the call to carry another's burden is an extraordinary one, but these are extraordinary times. In our increasingly polarized nation, when many elected officials and their strategists believe they need to only listen to those who already agree with them, we must carry our neighbors' burdens into politics with our own. We should ensure those we disagree with are heard as well, that their best arguments are responded to, that politicians on quote-unquote our side don't get away with simply dismissing, demagoguing against those who disagree with them, who disagree with us. There are structural reforms that can address this problem. Lee Drutman, for instance, has a book that I think just came out, or I believe it's coming out in March. I'm sorry. Lee Drutman. He'll advance his case for multi-membered congressional districts, which I think is a compelling idea. So that this idea that you would have, there are a number of different ways to set it up, but basically imagine if your congressional district was represented by 3 people, not just one. And so if your congressional district was, let's just, to make it easy, 70% Republican and 30% Democrat, instead of being represented by just one Republican, you'd be represented by 2 Republicans and 1 Democrat, so that more people felt like they had a voice. I think it's a compelling idea. I have become convinced that attempts at such reforms, though, are likely to be foiled or undermined from within without a reformation of civic character. So yes, we should talk about how we finance campaigns. We should talk about redistricting. We should talk about all these things. But without a reformation of civic character, these reforms are just going to be building on sinking sand. It is citizens themselves that need to become less susceptible, less likely to reward bad actors and destructive politics. And but structural changes like this require a citizenry formed to desire an inclusive democracy and representation. From what resources could we draw from to support something like that? Here we get to matters not principally about civic character, but even more deeply about spiritual character, about spiritual formation. We need to become the kind of people our politics needs. And so, of all that I've suggested today, which is drawn from my conviction that the gospel is real, that there are resources made available to us by God that we can draw on today, not just for the personal and the private, but for the public. This is what I want to close with. Excuse me. I'm a big Dallas Willard guy. I don't know if any of you read Willard. He has these great definitions for concepts, which he basically draws millennia of thought into something that we could understand in a pretty direct way. His definition for joy is a constant, pervasive sense of well-being. Basically, Augustine's definition. How much of our public dialogue, not to mention our personal lives, has been filled with a pervasive and constant sense of well-being? Did you all watch the State of the Union last night in the response? Would you say that that was full of a pervasive and constant sense of well-being? Did you watch the 12-person CNN panel that followed it? Was that full of a pervasive and constant sense of well-being? What does it say about us that our public life isn't joyful? It's so frantic. I've been thinking a lot about the 23rd Psalm lately. I'd always associated the Psalm with formal services and kitschy backdrops, sort of a psalm for quiet moments, peaceful reflection, something to take on retreat or put in a frame for a corner of the living room. This is the miss it's me. The 23rd Psalm is not just for the backdrop of our lives, a reminder in the moments when we finally catch our breath. No, this psalm is for when we are in the very thick of life, the very moment of crisis. David, of course, was not someone who lived a simple life. He was a warrior and a king. He led armies and slayed giants. He faced major trials, many of his own making, and it is with his enemies before him, the walls closing in, that David finds peace and that David finds joy. And this is because David knew and trusted the shepherd. Today, the same God who led David beside still waters and who prepared a table for him in the midst of his trial, that God is alive and well today. And if you have cast your lot with Jesus, he says that we can abide in him and he will take care of our needs. If David can find security in God as others plotted his demise, surely we can trust Jesus in our circumstances, personal and political. This doesn't mean that we ignore reality. As Dr. Raphael Warnock, who is pastor at Ebenezer Baptist Church, Dr. King's Church in Atlanta, he wrote, "It takes a tough mind and a tender heart to hold on to hope." I love that quote. It takes a tough mind and a tender heart to hold on to hope. Hope is not a cute way to obfuscate our circumstances. Hope clarifies them. This is the great relief of the psalm. David is not talking about something ethereal, something that's abstract. He's saying the most real thing is that God is setting a table for me in the presence of my enemy. That as he walks through the valley of the shadow of death, God meets him right there in the mess with blessing and anointing and comfort. When I meet with Christians around this country, especially young Christians, it is clear that the way that some have acted in politics has made them cynical about our faith. It's made many hesitant to share their faith, because it seems more and more that when people find out you're a Christian, they bring to that sort of whole number of assumptions largely drawn from politics. I understand that. I understand them. But here's what I remind them, and it's what I'll say to you as I close. We did not become Christians because of the hucksters and the showboats. They do not get to set the standard. They provide neither the question nor the answer. It is Jesus who is the standard for our faith. And he still speaks today. And no one can replace him. The imperfect examples of others should never obscure for us the perfect example of Christ. There is great hope for our politics, as there is in all things, because we have a firm hope in Jesus. And we need to know for ourselves that this hope that we've talked about today, nourished by the Holy Spirit, grounded in God's faithfulness, will see us through. Will see us through in our personal life, when we fall on our face, when we don't know what we're doing, when we feel like we're pretending. And then we could look at our friends and our neighbors and our fellow citizens in the eye and tell them that this gospel is for them too. That it does not matter what family they grew up in, what their politics are, what kind of music they listen to, that this gospel is for all people at all times. And they can have confidence in Jesus, who lived a blameless, perfect life, died for their sins, rose from the grave, and now invites them into his life to follow his perfect way. And once we've done that, we can say with joyful confidence, confidence that is full of a pervasive and constant sense of well-being, that this country and our politics needs Christians to carry that hope with them into public too, into the places of conflict and disrepair and hopelessness. It takes a tough mind and a tender heart to hold on to hope. Hold on, we must. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. That was great. We want to take a few minutes. We're going to give Michael a break just for a minute to grab a drink. We're going to ask you to take some time at your tables to discuss some of what you heard right now. Formulate some questions. We're going to do some Q&A at the end. There are some index cards and some pens at each table. So if you have a question ready, or if you're formulating a question, if you want to write it down, we'll come around, we'll grab those, and those will be the questions that we start with. So take about 15 minutes at your tables, discuss what you heard, get a drink, use the restroom, whatever you need. We're going to come back and we're going to do some Q&A in just a little bit. I'm going to read the questions, and then if we have time, we'll run them. Perfect. Great. All right, let's go ahead and get started. I've got a good stack of questions here, some really good ones. I got to eavesdrop on some really good conversations as well. Really good stuff going on. So we're going to take the rest of the time for some Q&A. And so we'll start with this. Michael, one of the questions is, how do you choose a party to influence? If you want to step into, you don't want to abdicate your responsibility. How do you actually choose a party to influence then?
Yeah. So I should say, and usually I wasn't planning on talking about that tonight, and usually, as I'm wont to do, I usually put in a couple more caveats than I do. That's why I like reading off a page. I can trust that a little bit better. So look, and I'm going to repeat this during the Q&A, if this Q&A is anything. None of this is about placing additional moral burden on you. One of the greatest problems with our politics right now is that politicians, advocacy groups, political actors intentionally place undue moral burden as a form of manipulation. So like if you feel a personal, so when I speak about like becoming independent, I'm speaking culturally, demographically, sort of the structures of, if you feel like, if you're going to be laying up at night and like, feeling like you need to go to confession like just don't join a political party if that's like your state of mind. So I just want to this is all about freedom, folks. Okay, this is I think, well, here, this may not be the best way to do it, but let me describe so I became a Democrat through a number of ways. One was familial. I mentioned my grandfather was he really wasn't political, but he also, they were the kind of Catholics that, on the mantle is like the Virgin Mary and JFK, and depending on the day, one picture was higher than the other. So it was very strong, like cultural thing. My grandfather was involved in his union, and so at that time, you were a Democrat if you were a union person. Then something I left out of sort of my coming to faith, because it's kind of like weird and hard to explain. I've loved R&B music since I was a very young child. Very emotional. Well, let me give you a good example. I asked my kindergarten school teacher, "Can I sing in class?" She finally says, "Yes, I sing Boys to Men's I'll Make Love to You." She cut that off really fast. Not appropriate. That factoid usually doesn't end up in my speaking engagements. I promise I'm getting to something political here, which is, R&B music was very important to me. Through R&B music, sort of political causes affiliated with and of concern to African American community. When I became interested in politics, civil rights and the Voting Rights Act were very important to me. So that led me to the Democratic Party in the time when I was choosing a political party. When I became a Christian, I knew, as I said in my remarks, I had some pretty fundamental disagreements with the Democratic Party, even at the time, on some key issues. There were also some issues where I felt really strongly. When I first read Romans and then read the rest of the Bible, I saw so many mentions of caring for the least of these, of the poor. And I saw, again, when I was sort of making a decision about my party affiliation, so this was like the latter second Bush term, I saw that lining up more with the Democratic Party. So a lot of it is familial background. What passions has God placed on your heart? We're allowed to read the times and sort of, what does my community need most right now? Where can I make the most difference? What's the best way to steward the influence I have? Now, for someone whose life experiences, whose passions have led them in another direction, I say we need that. There is nothing the Republican Party needs now more than faithful Christians who are proud to call themselves Republican, who are nevertheless willing to push within that party on an issue like immigration reform. There is nothing the Democratic Party needs now more than people who are faithful Christians, willing to call themselves Democrat, who are willing to push their party from the inside on an issue like the dignity of life or religious freedom. And so that's what we could be. And if we don't view partisan identity as a brand that we stamp on our forehead or some all-consuming identity, then it just frees us up. Frees us up to change parties if we feel we need to, because the times have changed, because the parties have changed. And so, look, this isn't about, and this is something that will come up again. We often look at politics as like the one realm of life that just confuses Jesus. That he just doesn't get what's going on. How am I ever going to explain this to Jesus? And I want you to know Jesus understands. When you go into the voting booth, he knows you didn't pick the candidates that you have to choose from. That, like, we just need to release the moral burden from this. We can only be responsible for what we're responsible for. We're not responsible as Christians for outcomes. We can only be responsible for what we have responsibility over. I cannot, as much as I try, decide what the Democratic Party platform is going to say on abortion in 2020. I can only be responsible for leveraging whatever influence I have in the position God has placed me to advance a viewpoint that I feel motivated by my faith to pursue. That's the best we could do. The question, though, is are we really doing that? Or are we making little compromises here and there to fit in, to get that promotion, to get along better with everybody, to not ruffle any feathers? Are we making compromises so that we aren't being faithful? That's what it. And you know that if you're a praying Christian, you're inviting God into your political life, just like you do your marriage, your vocation. Then you'll know that. And then you have to wrestle with those things. I've had to wrestle with those things.
That's good. So relatedly, if I want to influence my party, what's the first step or some practical and applicable ideas to do so? If I want to actually start that influence, what are some first steps that we can take?
Yeah. So there, it's like a broader, like, how do I influence politics? And then how do I influence a party? And they're kind of related. So the first is like, so I identify as a party and wield that as influence as well as you can. But by that, I mean, when you're writing your local representative, if he's or she is of your party, make sure you say, I'm a Democrat just like you. I'm a Republican just like you, and yet I disagree with you here. Or I'm a Democrat or a Republican just like you, and I'd like to encourage you in this direction. Two would be, and again, none of this is like, everyone has lives. Not everyone is called to be spending 40 hours a week volunteering in politics. So some of you are going to feel called in that way. Others of you, that's not, and that's okay. None of this is about placing moral burden on you. But if you choose to, I think you'd be surprised how easily you could get involved with your local county Democratic Party or local county Republican Party. I spoke at Dordt College or Dordt University, which is in Sioux County, Iowa. The most conservative county in Iowa. I was there for their presidential leadership conference. It's a Christian school, but the local Democratic Party there heard that I was going to be there, and I was surprised. I mean, between us, I haven't spoken at official Democratic Party events since the 2016 convention, and that was because the person running Faith Outreach for Hillary Clinton was a friend. I'm not going to be chair of the DNC anytime soon. because I didn't keep my mouth shut after I left government. But so I was, all that to say, I was kind of surprised when I received this invite. And I thought, what a great thing. And I decided to go there to talk to them about how you shouldn't let your party identity dictate your conscience. Which, you know, I'm not sure they still wanted me there. But one of the great surprises was they actually did. The question and answers after my talk was this local Democratic Party event, these officials saying, well, yeah, I've never felt exactly right with the party's position on this, but you're saying like I don't have to go along, like you're saying that when we send up to the state party, which then sends it up to the national party, our platform, like we could write something, we could write a different proposal, we could have a minority report that the Sioux County, Iowa Democrats don't think that the party is right on issue A or B or C, and that might cause a conversation at the state level, and who knows what that might cause. But even if it doesn't, at least we represented our community, and we could tell our community that like the local Democratic Party was being responsive to the concerns of the neighborhood. I had organizers from Democratic presidential campaigns coming up to me after saying the same things. I mean, these are people who are working like below minimum wage on these presidential campaigns who are like, I just never heard this. So I'd say that. The other thing I'd say is, so there's your own personal time. There's a great organization in Denver, Denver Institute for Faith and Work, right? And the reason why that organization sprung up, along with the Center for Faith and Work in New York and Made to Flourish and all of these vocation and work organizations, is because at some point in American evangelicalism, we came to terms with the fact that though we were teaching broad theological principles, that when it came to the area of work, Christians in their daily lives just weren't seeing how faith had anything to do with their work. They weren't able to connect the dots. And so we built up institutions to actually support that. Pastors were now preaching series on what does God have to say about your work. Parachurch organizations and institutes were created to develop explicit time to this area. Because look, if you're not seeing how God fits into your vocation, that's a third of your life. And I'm all for God showing up in dreams, but you can't really control that much. So it's more than a third if you're thinking about it. I think we need similar rise of institutions when it comes to faith in public life. We need to help people more explicitly connect the dots and see that the fruit of the Spirit is not just something for like your personal life and your marriage and how you treat the people you come across, but actually when we step out into the public, it's not like the fruit of the Spirit should just, well, I'll be a devil in public, but don't worry, back at home, I'm kind and polite to everyone. No, actually, Christians are called to actually be kind in public too. Christians are actually called to be gentle in public too, even if that doesn't seem to go along with like the political incentives. So all that to say, we should be investing in institutions. If you some of you may sponsor children through Compassion International or World Vision. Well, guess what? All these organizations have government affairs arms. One of the problems that they have is what they end up doing is having to fund the advocacy and government affairs work through extra donations that they have to seek out independently because no one wants to give to something that that there isn't a direct input and output. In other words, you can't say, you could sponsor a child for $70. You can't say, give $100 and we're going to pass this bill. Politics doesn't work that way. But Christians can see the value in this public work and say, well, I'm actually going to earmark my funding so that World Vision, yes, I want to sponsor a child through World Vision, but if governments are cutting foreign aid money that go directly to the child and the child's community that I'm sponsoring, then my $70 to sponsor that child is being undermined by the public policy changes that are being made. And so we could support institutions. We could support advocacy groups that line up with or line up as closely as possible with our view that will do advocacy work within political parties and help to change the parties. But those are a few suggestions. There's obviously a lot more.
Awesome. Can you give some examples of how the individual average citizen can carry a neighbor's burdens in the coming months as the political landscape gets hotter? How do we engage with each other, like in how we vote and how we point to the hope of Christ?
So I mentioned, I alluded to this a bit. This is just a true thing. There are congressional candidates, right? There are elected officials right now who know that even though they represent districts that are 30% evangelical or 30% Hispanic, that as long as they turn out enough of their supporters, they never have to worry about or talk to the minority population. Again, whether that's white evangelicals or whether it's, whatever, Catholics, African Americans, whatever. Like they just don't have to worry about them. So they could go do constituency meetings with the groups they need to get elected, and that's just how it works. There are, and I've talked to them, there are members of Congress who don't. There are churches who, if their congressional representation was different, would have first access, but because their representation is of the other party, they have no access at all. So one way in which sort of bearing one another's burdens, and this is, I think it applies to all of us. This is, it's obviously more effective if you're organizing sort of groups, and that could be just 10 friends, is making sure, like when you have time with an elected official, or making sure just when you're in spaces where political discourse is happening, that yes, maybe you're using, let's just say it's a 20-minute meeting or 20-minute whatever conversation. Yes, maybe using 15 minutes to talk about issues that are of core concern, personal concern to you, your immediate community. How about using 5 minutes of that time to say, you know what, I'm not even sure what I think about this policy idea, but my friend in the other party, the pastor of the black church down the street that can't get a meeting with you, raised this with me. And I wanted to see what's your response to that? Because I'm not sure where I stand, but I trust my brother or sister enough to think that they're coming with good motives, that they have a real concern at hand. So I haven't made my decision yet on where I stand on this, but I care enough at least to hear your response to their best argument. So that's one way it could work. It's also a matter of look, are you willing to give money, to volunteer, to on issues that aren't of direct concern to you? You might have a mortgage and whatever. Housing may not be an issue to you, but I can promise you, just like in every other city, major city in this issue, we're in a housing crisis right now that's only in its early beginnings, and cities are wrestling with how to deal with this. And so even if it's not a primary concern to you, is there a local housing organization here that's doing advocacy work that you could lick some envelopes for them, that you could march with them, that you could show up at the city council meeting and make sure that they're not overcrowded by folks who are able to hire big lobbyists and who are able to advance well-paid interests? And so, yeah, I mean, it's a matter of thinking about whatever influence and resources that you have for this, not in a way that's burdensome, but like actually sitting down and saying, thinking about your next 6 months, thinking about your next 9 months, your next year, and saying, look, I have a job, I have kids, I have duties at church, but I'm carving out this 5% of my finances, this 5% of my time to try and steward that in the public realm and politics to the best of my ability, and then making wise decisions about that in discernment, not just with your own history, your own issues, but actually talking with people who are different than yourself, reading people who are different than yourself, consulting with churches that have different makeup than your own, and figuring out, well, where is the greatest need now, and where does that need match up with my ability to actually do something about it?
That's good. Can you describe or define the difference between unity and uniformity as you've observed in politics today?
Yeah. Uniformity. The first time I've gotten this specific question, so I'll issue a correction later tonight on Twitter if I actually think about this and think, oh no, that wasn't right. But I'm thinking of some specific examples right now. Uniformity is usually something that is cultivated through the use of coercion and power. And it usually involves either compromise or just an overlooking of inconvenient interests. Unity actually doesn't require complete agreement, right? And this is scriptural. I Paul writes. Unity means that you're all invested in the project of figuring things out together. We were just talking about this. At its best, our politics is not, oh, everyone agrees at what rate the capital gain should be taxed. It's we're all committed to figuring out how we can live together. That's fracturing in our country right now. It's becoming very controversial to saying that you would want to figure out how to live together with people who politically disagree with you. I actually had, I tweeted that last night during the State of the Union, I said my pro-Trump friends are thinking this is pretty good speech. And I had someone get on my DM saying, how could you have pro-Trump friends? I'm like, with everything else I tweeted tonight, that's what you're going to pick out? Like, that I know some people who support, like, it's half the country. Like, what kind of privileged place do you have to be in to say that you don't know, you don't have to associate with anybody who politically disagrees with you? Like, that's not, it's becoming very controversial. Now, look, I have vehement political disagreements. But look, if politics is all about enforced uniformity, that's always gonna crumble. That leads to backlash. You think that you're taking a step forward, but then you look and it's like, oh, I'm 3 steps back. If it's about unity, that's a shared project that we could be invested in together, and that could be what that does require, though, is what I talked about. It requires some level of formed civic and spiritual character to be able to resist some of the more petty impulses that politics and tribalism sort of inspires in us.
Well, and relatedly, a couple questions that are similar. How do we break through the us versus them in politics? And how best to reshape that civic character? And somebody listed some ideas, talking to others, hosting dinners with those who are dissimilar and or similar to us. But what does it look like to break through that us versus them and start to reform that civic character?
Yeah, so you, I've been giving talks on civility around the country, and I've learned that I knew this going in, but I've learned I've had to put like 3 or 4 levels of fail-safes to try and prevent this, which is give a speech on civility and walk out, and the audience member's takeaway is, man, that was a great speech. It was exactly right. If only the other side would be civil, we'd be able to really get somewhere. It's like, no, this was first and foremost a challenge to you and your folks. And then you could talk about the other party. So like one of the first things that we could do is make sure, and one project I'm working on is sort of what are 21st century, again, I'm a Willard guy, what are 21st century spiritual disciplines that could push back on some of these impulses that are cultivated in us. One of them is like, look through your social media feed. If you're on social media, look through your Facebook. If your last 10 posts are about how great your side is and how awful the other side is, then that gives you a pretty good indication. I try and make sure that I'm harder on Democrats than I am on Republicans. When I see something like what happened to, and I'm not saying everyone has to agree with what Mitt Romney did today being good. Given my place, it was important for me to be very vocal and affirming Mitt Romney, who I spent 9 months making sure he wasn't elected to be president, affirming him and what he did as a Republican. And I have Democrats in my mention saying, why are you just giving him credit for something he should have done anyways? And it's like, get out of here. Like, what are we doing here that we can't even acknowledge when people we disagree with on other issues are doing the right thing? So one of the way to break up the us and them is to make sure that your us and your them aren't the same in every situation. If your us and your them are the same in every situation, then that probably suggests that you're operating from a tribal mindset. Because I know I'm not right with myself on everything. So how is it that Nancy Pelosi or Donald Trump is somehow right no matter what they do? Like we just gotta like face reality here. And just because you challenge your party doesn't mean, or challenge. I know some people who are so afraid of saying anything about President Trump because they think they're giving something to Democrats. Or if you say anything nice about President Trump, as I did last night, he talked about in the State of the Union, $50 million additional dollars going to neonatal research. Well, I have a history of promoting health research related to women and children has been historically underfunded in this country. Well, I don't care if the money comes from President Trump or AOC. Like that money's good if it's good. And so I wanted to praise that. And like really, one of the ways to relieve moral burden is to understand that none of us are so influential that like just being honest is going to change the course of history in like some awfully drastic way. You know, like my saying something nice about President Trump that's not going to be the thing that tips the balance. Like my job is to be faithful with what is in front of me, not try and orchestrate some set of circumstances. And that's your job too.
That's great. Interesting question here. How do we assess truth from the media in the midst of the spin and bias behind all press?
So I do just want to go back and affirm. I think that getting together, talking about differences is really good. I guess one thing I'd say on that is I have people who come to me sometimes and are like, every time I get together with this family member, the night ends early because of political disagreements. How could I what am I saying? Like, how could I convince them to take my position in a way that like they'll feel good about? And I say that to say, yes, having conversations with people you disagree with politically can be good. I think oftentimes people feel like they got to talk about politics with the people that they least want to talk about politics with. And I want to free you from that burden. Like sometimes it's just not going to be a productive thing. And you don't have the responsibility of persuading everyone that comes in your midst, especially the most difficult people, that they ought to agree with you politically. Sometimes it's just not worth it. So all that to say, yes, it's great to get together, especially there are organizations like Better Angels, and there are some other examples that facilitate, I think, healthy, bipartisan, multi-partisan, gatherings. That could be great. I think the church should be a place where we facilitate hearing from people with different political perspectives that are able to say, I believe in this really strongly, but this is actually subordinate to my confidence in the sovereignty of God. But so I wanted to go back to that question. It's an important one. Remind me about this question. Oh, trustworthiness of media. Look, the best you can do is read broadly, read things that upset you, read things that challenge you. If you haven't been upset by something that you've read, and if you haven't read something that maybe you thought I might be wrong on this issue in the last week, your news consumption is wrong. It's just bad. Politics is so complicated. The issues we face are so complicated. Look, I speak on this stuff for a living, and I go to bed at night thinking, gosh, I think I'm right, but goodness, I may be wrong. Lord, forgive me, But there are, even when it's not for profit, it's for profit. It's all about what we're rewarding. And right now we have people who are rewarding having their biases not challenged, but rewarded and reinforced. So we need to push back on that. So let me give you some publications that I read. I read the National Review. I read First Things. I read the Dispatch and David French and his work. So that's on the right, and there are others, but we could. Reading the major newspapers is just really important, not just to get your sort of pulse on things, but it's a point of view. So I don't read everything every day, but I'm trying to give you some outlets to choose from. New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal. On the left, I've really enjoyed reading a publication called the Boston Review. With Bernie running, I've been reading Jacobin, which is just important. There are some reporters and columnists I like. I like Christine Emba at the Washington Post. I like David French. I like Ross Douthat. I like Liz Brunig, who's now just moved over to the New York Times. I like Molly Ball, who's a journalist for Time. I like John Ward, who's a journalist at Yahoo News. I like Van Newkirk at The Atlantic. I like Jamel Bowie. I disagree with him a great deal. There's no one, there are people you read that are like, I disagree with this, but my goodness, he's smarter than I am. Jamel Bowie at the Times is a good example of that. I hope you're not recording this, Jamel. And so and follow up with me on social media if you're looking for. I feel like I'm a little weak. I don't really know what Democrats think. I don't know what socialists think. I don't know what conservatives think. I don't know what nationalists think. Like, it's really important that we know the major streams of thought, because if we don't know what other people are thinking, we're going along. And listen, no matter how this election goes in November, half the country is not going to have any understanding of what were they thinking. And it's because they're not even talking to anyone who supports the other candidate. It's why I tweeted that thing about the State of the Union, because I know I have a bunch of followers who are watching the State of the Union, and they can't even see. Wow, when the president says that unemployment is at an all-time low, there are some people who think that's a great thing, even though you may not be able to process it, emotionally. Like, it's important that we understand. It's important that we understand what's motivating people who are different from us to have the positions they do. Otherwise, we just think that people are motivated by nothing but malicious intent, by ignorance, and that's just not a healthy. You can't reach unity if that's how you're thinking about your neighbors.
That's great. You mentioned bipartisan forums. Just want to let you know, Common Cause is a local organization that has a bipartisan forum coming up this coming Saturday. So if you're looking for something like that, Common Cause would be an interesting one to be part of. What is the role of government for the Christian in the sense of government needs to do more or government should be doing less? What's the right balance? Where should we, where do we find our justification for what government does?
Yeah. So there are a number of ways to answer this question. The first is that let's again reset the frame. As Christians, we participate in politics because it's one forum, an essential forum, not the most important, but an essential forum for loving our neighbor. And we go to politics not to get emotional or spiritual needs met, but we go to advance justice and affirm human dignity within the limited but essential realms of what government does. So that's the important thing. And so when we consider these kinds of questions, look, C.S. Lewis writes in this essay, Meditations on the Third Commandment, he's considering whether the UK should have a explicitly Christian party, like the Germans have a Christian party. France at the time had the Nordics had Christian political parties. UK didn't. And C.S. Lewis is writing, considering this, and he says one of the most important things that you can keep in mind when you're thinking about faith and politics. He says, and I'm paraphrasing a bit here, but he says the greatest temptation when we combine our faith with politics is to claim God hath said when God has not spoken at all. What he means there is it's so easy to slip from I support this policy position or my support for this policy position is motivated by my faith. Very easy to slip from that into my policy position is the Christian position. And so I want to be really careful about sort of stamping with the same stamp that I'd place on Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. I really don't want to use that same stamp on Medicaid's a good thing. I think Medicaid's a good thing. I think God could probably approve of a whole lot of ways for taking care of poor people and their healthcare needs. I'm not sure Jesus endorses Medicaid, and I wouldn't want to claim that. What you do have to ask, though, is what does your policy position, what is the impact it's going to have, particularly for the less fortunate? So that changes the paradigm. It's no longer is bigger government better or smaller government better. It's in this case, would government intervention help people in need, or would it hurt people in need? Or would smaller government here help people in need, or would it hurt people in need? And we have to be focused on the person. Again, it's great to read Milton Friedman, it's great to read Keynes, but if this has been one of the big mistakes of human and political history, and Christians have made it, which is that they equate a certain economic or political philosophy with the kingdom of God, and then all of a sudden they're willing to make all of these compromises on their way to that human kingdom. They're willing to say, well, do you know what? This is gonna hurt some poor people in the short run, but you just wait until we get the free market set up exactly the way it ought to be. Or you just wait until we get this socialist system set up exactly the way it ought to be. Then everyone's gonna be fantastic. And those sort of throwing the disinherited, as Howard Thurman said, the disinherited under the bus in pursuit of some political utopia, that's just, we ought to be very cautious about that as Christians. So again, I'd say we want to be, I think, especially American history and recent history shows, government can do some really powerful things on behalf of people, and it could make some really sour mistakes. It can do a lot of damage. There can be a lot of unintended consequences. And so I just want to pivot the question to not sort of is government good or bad, but when we're talking about discrete issues, how does this affect those in need? And what is your plan? So, I mean, just to get a little more specific, if you're going to cut food stamps, cut 800,000 people off of food stamps, maybe there's like a rationale for that, but your rationale has to include how those 800,000 people are going to get food. Like if you don't have an answer for that, if your answer is, we need to reduce the size of government, well, that doesn't really meet the human need question there. If you're going to talk about, I think we want to use a framework that doesn't prioritize ideas over people. And if we're thinking about people and about how they're being served by the policies we're advancing, then there's a lot of freedom within that. Again, I don't think that there's any sort of Christian platform that says at what rate capital gains ought to be taxed and how many immigrants ought to be able to come into the country. Like that's not what this is. But at any time, if you are sort of severing off, let me tell one story. Because I think hopefully it was helpful. After the shooting in Las Vegas, my church held a church service of lament, and my pastor during that service raised research from Barna, which is a Christian research firm, and it was an amazing sort of enlightening two-part question. The first part was, if your family or your property was under threat, would you use violence to protect your property or your family? I should say there's like long history of Christian debate around these questions like this. I don't think it's a settled issue. I think there are good arguments on both sides, both at the personal and at the political level. That's not the point, so don't get hung up on the specific instance. But about 70% of Christians said, yes, I would use violence, and 30% said no. The next question was, do you think Jesus would approach the situation in the same way? Only 30% said, yes, Jesus would approach the situation in the same way I do. See what happens there? Like I almost don't care about what the issue stance is. What I care about is someone who cares a lot about discipleship, cares a lot about the formation of Christian character, cares a lot about people who are following Jesus with their whole hearts. The problem there is that split. What happens when you say that my position on an issue is not what Jesus would do is you're actually causing a split in your soul. There's a disintegration that happens that makes it very difficult to follow Jesus in other realms of your life as well. And so when it comes to politics, I'm and this is somewhat controversial, I'm less concerned with the specific policy. I have great faith that as long as Christians are praying in discernment with the Holy Spirit, that we'll be in a much better place as a country. My real concern is when Christians are intentionally saying, do you know what? There's something about what Jesus is asking me, which is not meant for this world. That somehow what Jesus wants in our public life and my personal life, he just doesn't understand. That actually following Jesus is not the safest way to go. And I want to tell you, following Jesus is the safest way to go in your personal life and in your public life. And when we think about public questions.
Well, that's a great place to end. We're out of time. I apologize if we didn't get to your question. Hopefully he at least was able to touch on it. But we're going to wrap it up here. First off, let's thank Michael for being with us tonight. That was really excellent stuff. I want to thank some of the team that helped to put this together. Katie and Rob, Bobby, Ta, Chas, some of the decorations and registration, all the work that went into this. I want to thank our sponsors. Sola Church brought Michael in and was able to cover his costs and organize this. And Denver Seminary also contributed. I think we've got a lot of people here from Denver Seminary as well, so thank you to Denver Seminary. A couple quick upcoming events. So this is actually kicking off a series for us in Sola Church about politics. It's called The Kingdom and the Nation. And our next session is going to be about immigration. And then we're going to follow that up with poverty. And then we're going to have a ballot forum before the general election. We're going to look at all the ballot initiatives and talk through them as a community. So part of our immigration time in next month, March 15th, Matthew Sorens, who is the, I always have to look up his title, U.S. Director of Church Mobilization for World Relief. He's the author of Welcoming the Stranger. He's going to be with us on Sunday, March 15th. We actually meet over at Buck Rec Center at 10:30 a.m. So if that is interesting to you, we'd love to have you. We'll put out some more material about that. And if you're interested, we are going to be eating breakfast tomorrow at Graceful Cafe with Michael. If you want to stop by Graceful here in Littleton, Graceful Cafe provides a home in the Littleton community where people of all backgrounds can gather, eat well, and be inspired to give back. We love that space, and we're excited to be there tomorrow with Michael at 8 a.m. If you want to stop by, if you didn't get your question answered and you want to do that, please feel free to come by, get breakfast, and join us there. All right. Thank you so much for coming. We appreciate your attendance.